Amy Bender is an American author who was born June 28, 1969. She is the daughter of a psychiatrist and a dance teacher and lives in Los Angeles, California. She currently teaches at the University of Southern California after receiving a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing from the University of California, Irvine. Bender is notorious for her heavy metaphor usage and writing in a style known as magical realism. The Remember, a short story first published in 1997 in the Missouri Review, and later in her first book collection, The Girl in the Flammable Skirt, is not an exception. Bender weaves a tale around Annie, the protagonist, and her lover Ben in a matter-of-fact fashion. It is a story told through Annie's perspective as she watches Ben de-evolve through a series of animals before her eyes, until ultimately she faces the decision to let him go or watch him turn into nothing. Magical realism, the style that Amy Bender is often identified with, is a genre of writing that is realist in style but with fantastic or whimsical elements. These magical additions are normal within the character's world and should be considered as such by the reader. Over the past few decades, the genre lines have blurred, crossing over into fantasy or science fiction. This is in opposition to what magical fiction is traditionally known as, serious and non-escapism pieces of fiction. The world, despite any fantasy pieces in it, is very much real to the characters that live there. In The Rememberer, Bender is clearly writing a reflection on the deterioration of memory or dementia-type diseases. The Rememberer will be compared to the magical realism genre, with main ideas of style associated with that genre. Time is not linear, causality is subjective, and mainly, that the magical and the ordinary are no different from each other. It will look at the element of dementia, often discussed in three main stages: early, moderate, and late in Bender's realm of magical realism. To write an analysis on the Rememberer, I dived a little deeper into Bender's background. Bender learned her basis of metaphorical language as a child from her father. She describes his work as follows: I think psychiatry is also all about metaphors, or what I find most beautiful about it is metaphorical. There is an enormous amount of interviews and speaking events featuring Bender. I focused mainly on interviews that would help me understand Bender as a writer and a person, and try to understand her headspace during the time period when she wrote The Rememberer. She often speaks of her writing process. She sets aside time each day devoted to only writing. Here, she lets her creativity wander. Her work commonly speaks in metaphors under the disguise of magical realism. In order to analyze The Rememberer further, I needed to understand what magical realism was. Doing so took some research and time to think about the genre. I found an article online written by Bruce Rogers titled, What is Magical Realism Really? That helped me understand the genre better. It is a way of telling a story, whether that is through writing or another style of art, that is serious, real, and with bits of magical elements. I think the best pop culture representation of magical realism to further help us in understanding the genre is the movie Big Fish. In it, the main character Edward Bloom tells the story of his life. He befriends a giant, is hired into a circus by a werewolf, and time stops as he first lays eyes on the love of his life, Sandra. The following is a short clip from the movie where Edward encounters his boss, Mr. Calloway, as a werewolf for the first time. Notice how him being a werewolf was never in question.
Didn't kill anything, did I?
A few rabbits, but I think one of them was already dead.
Oh. That would explain the indigestion.
I also did some research on dementia and Alzheimer's in order to understand the disintegration of Ben's character. Dementia is often categorized in three stages. In the early stages, the signs are often associated with mild memory loss and confusion. These increase in later stages, along with the failing ability to care for oneself. The change in Annie's role throughout the story was the most fascinating to me. Ben's de-evolution occurs down each stage of dementia progression, leading us through the winding trail of Annie's change. She began as Ben's lover, lost him to his disease, turning her into his caregiver, and then finally loses him altogether. Unfortunately, writing about Annie's character development proved to be difficult for me. Eventually, I chose to let it go and focused my analysis on Ben and how magical realism leads the reader down a path of his reverse evolution. In a review of The Girl in the Flammable Skirt, Stephanie Zacharek stated that Bender sets up too obvious conflict in her stories and often has a weakness for spelling out too much of the obvious. I disagreed with this statement in regards to The Rememberer. On the surface of the story, it appears as a fantasy love story with a sad ending. It wasn't until further exploration of the subject, through rereadings and class discussions, that the characters really unfolded for me, and the story that Bender was telling was really the downward path of a patient with dementia. The following is an excerpt of The Rememberer as read by the author Amy Bender.
When I go to the kitchen, I peer in the glass and see he's some kind of salamander now. He's small. Ben, I whisper, do you remember me? Do you remember? His eyes roll up in his head, and I dribble honey into the water. He used to love honey. He looks at it and then swims to the other end of the pan. This is the limit of my limits. Here it is. You don't ever know for sure where it is, and then you bump up against it, and bam, you're there. Because I cannot bear to look down into the water and not be able to find him at all, to search the tiny clear waves with a microscope lens, and to locate my lover, the one-celled wonder, brainless, benign, heading clear and small like an eye floater into nothingness. I put him in the passenger seat of the car and drive him to the beach. Walking down the sand, I nod at people on towels, laying their bodies out to the sun and wishing. At the water's edge, I stoop down and place the whole pan on the tip of a baby wave. Ben the salamander swims out. I wave to the water with both arms, big enough for him to see if he looks back. I turn around and walk back to the car.
In one interview, Bender said, "We were always constantly making metaphors." In one critical review of her work, Joy Press of the New York Times said, "Such heavy-handed metaphor is not uncommon in these stories. Too often, overbearing symbolism throws Bender's fragile concoctions out of whack." In magical realism, the reader considers that the fantastic and the ordinary are one and the same in the character's universe. Press is too tied up in the metaphors of Bender's work instead of reading it as truth. An editor at the Masters Review, Sadie Tizer, stated, "It would be a shame for any of these magical realist stories to be read as formulaic metaphors." These thoughts are summed up with the idea that magic has a natural place in these stories. To Annie, it isn't about Ben turning into a salamander, this is about him succumbing to dementia. At the same time that Bender wrote this story, she was dealing with two main events in her personal life. She was experiencing a breakup, and her mother was caring for her soon-to-be passing grandparent. These events are mirrored in the story as Annie and Ben are faced with an unexpected disease, his reverse evolution, or his path through dementia by means of magical realism. As a whole, I think Amy Bender makes a strong statement about dementia-type diseases through her use of unreal elements. It is a story of caring for a loved one who is slowly losing their self, and a way of handling the unexpected new reality that comes with it. She leads the reader down a path of impossible, yet believable circumstances in the world she has created for her characters.